And there's football tonight, and your kids may not know that, and so if you would, please put your phone on vibrate. It's been a joy to have Brother Dave. I love it because all afternoon I get to think of questions to ask him, and so it's been a blessing to have him. Brother Dave, you come and be a blessing to us tonight, sir.
Thank you again, Pastor Cochran. What a joy to be with you folks. It's a good crowd for Monday night. I'm impressed. That's great. I do hope you've been enjoying our creation investigation. I've got some fossils here tonight. I got a Spinosaurus fossil, I got a T-Rex tooth, I got a little dinosaur knee bone. I have some coprolite. I know some of the kids know because we've talked about it, but do any of you adults know what coprolite is? Yes?
It's dino poo.
Dino doo-doo, fossilized dino doo-doo. Doesn't stink anymore. You can come take a look at it. I got amber with some bugs in it. And of course, we have our books for sale still. We have some of the Chronicles of Dinosauria, the hardback, $10. Some of the Dino Days Adventures, the softback for $5. Got some more pamphlets if you haven't already grabbed one. We're marching forward in our creation investigation. For Sunday school, we talked about dinosaurs. And then for our Sunday morning service, we talked about answering atheists. And then last night we talked about should creation be taught in the public schools. Now we want to kind of get in the weeds a little bit tonight on evolution. Tonight is the most technical of my presentations, but I always like to really kind of deal with the main arguments that the evolutionists put out. So we're going to talk about missing links in evolution, problems in evolution tonight. You guys are a smart crowd. I know you can hang with me. And then tomorrow night it'll just be really a fun presentation. We'll talk about the Garden of Eden. Is there scientific evidence for the Garden of Eden? What about the ape men? These guys are supposedly half human, half apes. We'll talk about the early earth. Was it Eden or ape men? We'll talk about God's beautiful creation, the vapor canopy, and some of that stuff. And then we'll wrap it up on Wednesday night by talking about the flood. We'll talk about some exciting new evidences that we have for the flood. But tonight we're going to talk about evolution, problems with evolution. Now when I talk about missing links, I'm not talking about kind of half of this and kind of half of that, kind of like this redneck motorcycle, this Kawasaki there. A redneck motorcycle. I'm talking about missing links in their theory, missing links in the chain of logic, if you will, right? Now, hopefully this slide looks familiar to you. I told you you would see this one again. This is our two models. Remember we talked about it yesterday. How would I like to see things taught to children in the school? I'd like to see two models taught. Sometimes people come in and say, well, why would you want evolution taught at all? Well, a lot of smart people believe it. A lot of people around the world believe it. If you're a homeschooler, I think you should teach your children evolution. Just as being educated, just being informed so that you can engage with people around about you. Now, you should learn about the problems with it too. That's what they don't teach you in the schools, unfortunately. But we are going to talk about origin by design versus natural origin quite a bit tonight. And then tomorrow night we're going to talk about how God made things good, how things were bigger and healthier in the past. People lived a long time. And then we'll talk about the catastrophe on Wednesday night. We'll talk about the Great Flood. Our jumping off place in God's Word is going to be 2 Peter chapter 3. If you've got your copy of God's Word, you're welcome to turn there. I will have the verses up here on the overhead. 2 Peter chapter 3 is a prophecy of the end times. Part of the reason why I think we're living pretty close to the end times is this verse from 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 3 says this, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust. What's a scoffer? Somebody tell me, what's a scoffer? It's kind of a word we don't use too often. What's a scoffer?
I don't know. Someone who scoffs?
Someone who scoffs. Well, what's scoffing? Someone who mocks. It's someone who's a critic, someone who's a skeptic. Well, I'm not sure I believe that. Prove that to me. Today we have folks that like to go around and just make fun of stuff. They don't ever want to build anything up. All they want to do is find something that's been respected in the past and tear it down. There's a lot of scoffers out there today. And that's why I think we're in the end times. So the Bible predicts that these guys are going to come, but not only that, but the Bible predicts exactly what they're going to say. Look at the next verse. In verse 4 it says, then saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Now, don't make a mistake. It's not like they believe in creation versus evolution. It just means from the origin. That's what the Greek means there. It means like from way, way, way back in the beginning, all things just continue as they were. Now that is a particular philosophy that we call uniformitarianism. And this kind of came into vogue along with Charles Darwin, this idea that if you look back over the millions of years, there wasn't a big flood. It was the same kind of processes that we see today. Things are very uniform. And they just continue on, small catastrophes, little hurricanes and earthquakes and stuff like this, but no global flood. And so this idea, all things continue as they were, everything is very consistent year after year after year, that is the philosophy that the evolutionists have built on. So the Bible predicts the coming of the scoffers, it predicts exactly what they're going to say, and then it tells us how we can answer them. Now, I'm not going to get too much into this because I'm going to talk about this on Wednesday. But we can answer them by the conditions of the early earth. We'll talk about the water vapor canopy. It explains a lot. And the Genesis flood. That explains a lot too. And that's how you answer these skeptics. Well, here's our outline for this evening. I want to give you the best arguments the evolutionists have. Now, when some evolutionist writes a book and it's a bestseller, I buy it. And I read it, and I try to really understand their arguments as best I can. I want to get their best arguments so I can respond to them. I do debates with them and stuff. So I have in my library books by Richard Dawkins, this atheist from Oxford. I've bought books by Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionist from Harvard, and I've got all these books by evolutionists because I want to know their best arguments. So I'm going to give you their best arguments, and then I want to talk about some problems for them. Two big problems: biological complexity and the mechanism challenge. Those will both go pretty quick. Most of our time is going to be spent on the first one tonight. Now, when we talk about evolution, you may remember this from yesterday, it is molecules to man transformation. That is what evolution is. It's not small different changes, rabbits, or a different skin color in a particular animal. No. It is molecules to man transformation. But even in that, evolutionists have lots of different types of evolution. For example, you might hear about cosmic evolution, and that's how we got the universe from the Big Bang. Then there's stellar evolution, how you got stars. And then there's chemical evolution, how we got, well, most everything coming out of the Big Bang was just hydrogen. So how did you get carbon? Well, we're carbon-based life forms. And how do you get uranium and lithium and all these different kinds of elements? And so chemical evolution. And then organic evolution. Once you've got all the necessary chemicals for life, how do you go from just rocks and water to getting that first living thing? That's complicated. We'll talk about that. But organic evolution, and then macroevolution. Once you have something that's alive, how do you change it from that to all these different kinds of animals? Major changes into fish and birds and apes and humans and stuff. That's macroevolution. And then microevolution. Microevolution is variation within the kind. Remember the rabbits? That's microevolution. The fact that maybe you might have a population of moths, and some of the moths will be light-colored and dark-colored. That's microevolution. If you have cat and the cat has kittens, well, they're different colors in the kittens, right? Microevolution. Now, of all of these kinds of evolution, only one has ever been observed. What is it? Isaiah.
The evolving of animals.
Which one, though? Which one of these? We had on the front row here. Micro is the only one that's ever been observed. All the rest of this is just theories. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but I'm just telling you it's not hard science. It's speculation about the past. It's thinking, well, maybe, this happened this way and that happened that way. It's philosophical in nature, not hard science. So we do have variation in cats and dogs. We got big dogs. We got little tiny dogs that can ride on top of the big dogs. But guess what? It's still a dog. We have big horses and little horses. And yes, they shared a common ancestor. And guess what it was? A horse, of course. And so that's microevolution. So the problem is, how do you explain macroevolution? And when you ask them this, here's Richard Dawkins in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. He points out to some specific things: pore designs, biogeography, vestigial structures, fossil record, and homology. Well, that's a lot of complicated sounding stuff. So let me just kind of explain it. But those are your key arguments for evolution right there. So the number one we're going to talk about is biogeography, the distribution of plants and animals around the world. Like there's different kinds of animals in different parts of the world. For example, you go to Australia and you got a lot of marsupials. What's a marsupial? Who knows? Yes. An animal that carries their baby in a pouch. So the mom will have the baby down in its uterus for a little bit, but when it pops out, it's still only half formed. It can't go and survive on its own. So it climbs up into the pouch. Think of a kangaroo, but there's marsupial rats and wombats and all different things. And it sits in there and it sucks on the little teat and it matures the rest of the way in the pouch. And then eventually hops out, and now it's ready to go on its own. But that's biogeography. And then embryology, the way an embryo develops, they say is evidence for evolution. Well, the fossil record, you guys know what that is. It's all these different rocks and things that are in the layers that were once alive, but now they've been mineralized and turned to rocks. And then mocking the idea of a designer God. We'll talk about that. And finally, nested hierarchy. We'll talk about that. But those are your 5 arguments for evolution. I'm going to take them one at a time. The first one is biogeography. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because this used to be a major argument for evolution, but now they've kind of given up on it. There are so many problems. The best one they got is Australia. They think, well, maybe a marsupial went there and somehow got across Australia, and so its descendants were all marsupials, and we only have one marsupial here in North America. Does anybody know what it is? What is it? That's very good, a possum. Excellent, young man. It's an opossum. And so, but mostly biogeography, there's all kinds of problems, explaining why things evolved the way they did and why they're spread around the world the way they are. And so here's a quote from an evolutionist. Almost all my quotes are going to be from evolutionists tonight. Historically, the geographical distribution of organisms across the globe was considered evidence for evolution. As animals migrated and diversified, more local common ancestors gave rise to similar organisms. Recent books on teaching evolution no longer give it as an argument for evolution. For example, the National Academy of Sciences book Teaching About Evolution and the Nature of Science only mentions it historically. So it really in the last 10, 15 years, it's fallen off. Here's 2018, Evolution News. It's far from true that biogeography unambiguously supports common ancestry or evolution from a common ancestor. Indeed, there are many tenacious problems of biogeography and paleobiogeography that do not square well with evolutionary paradigm of common descent. So they've kind of given up on this thing, and I'm not going to really spend a lot more time on it. Once in a while, somebody will mention to you. I just want you to know what it is. But then embryology. So this was a big one back in Haeckel's day. Remember, Haeckel was that nasty racist guy that really wrote some terribly horrible things about black people in Germany. And he's the one that came up with this idea that as an embryo develops, so the sperm and the egg come together, and then this little embryo starts to divide, and eventually it becomes this little baby that gets, the fetus that gets born. And it goes through these different stages. Well, he said those stages reinitiate its evolutionary past. They relive its past. Now, this has been completely discredited. It doesn't happen, and yet it's still in the textbooks. You will see it today. People will argue about it, even though it's been proven to be false. It's been proven to be false. In fact, Haeckel actually fraudulently altered the data. It's not like he didn't know better. He purposely altered the data. It's a fraud. Here are Haeckel's drawings. Now, watch how this is supposedly arguments for evolution. Here is a fish. See the fishy there? Well, it starts off back like that. Here's a tortoise, a chick, a hog, a calf. And you see how in the beginning they all look very much alike. And so the evolutionists say, well, that proves that we all came from a common ancestor. Now remember, this is just the embryos. They're developing, and they all develop from kind of a round egg, so it's not too surprising that they look a little bit alike. But then they'll say, oh, there's these gill slits. You see these little folds here? Now, the embryo never breathes through these things. The embryo's got a umbilical cord. It comes in and feeds him his oxygen. But they'll say, well, that means that your great ancestor was a fish, Because you got those gill slits there in the embryo. And so these gill slits supposedly prove that we have a common ancestor, and then eventually all these different types of animals diverge into a human, a rabbit, a calf, or a hog, or whatever. Now, just because there's some folds doesn't mean that they're gill slits. I mean, there's some guys that when they get older, they have folds. Does that mean they're going back to being a fish? Come on, this is a bad argument. But it actually has been proven to be a fake. It's proven to be a fraud. Here's how the embryos really look, starting off like as eggs, and at no point do they all line up and look the same. Yes, you do have kind of a generally fishy look to them somewhat there, but Darwin considered this the strongest single class of facts in favor of his theory. Haeckel called it his biogenetic law. And it's been completely proven to be a fraud. He altered the data, and yet you have his fake drawings still used in textbooks. This is a 2013 textbook, Bringing Fossils to Life, and it's taught to kids in school. A complete fake, and evolution should be ashamed of themselves. Okay, let's talk about the fossil record. We're going to have to spend a little more time on this one, because it's important. The fossil record. Now, what I want to do is I want to give you the big picture of the fossil record. Let's zoom way out and let's look at the broad picture. Then we'll argue about some of the ones the evolutionists like to point to. But the big picture is the fossil record is characterized by abrupt appearance. That is, we don't have any cats, and then all of a sudden, poof, a fully formed cat. We don't have something that's kind of a half kitty, kind of evolving, oh, now it's a cat. No, cats suddenly appear, abrupt appearance. Here's Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionist, Harvard University. In his book, The Panda's Thumb, he says, all paleontologists know the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. What's he saying? He's saying we got dogs and we got cats. We don't have dats and cogs. We're missing the in-betweens, the missing links. And he's admitting it. So the number one thing about the fossil record is abrupt appearance. And the worst thing of all for the evolutionists is something called the Cambrian explosion. That is, when you dig down to the very bottom layers, what's called the Cambrian, all of the major kinds of living things appear instantly fully formed, in a geological instant. And that has given them fits all through the years. Here is a quote, again by Stephen Jay Gould. The fossil record caused Darwin more grief than joy. Nothing distressed him more than the Cambrian explosion, the coincident appearance of almost all complex organic designs. So the fossil record is characterized by abrupt appearance. Here's Eugene Koonin, 2007, the Cambrian explosion in animal evolution during which all the diverse body plans appear to have emerged almost in a geological instant is a highly publicized enigma. Major transitions in biological evolution show the same pattern of sudden emergence of diverse forms at new level of complexity. So it's a problem. They don't like to talk about it, but when you actually look into their technical literature, they admit this. And that's where I find a lot of these quotes. The second thing, the fossil record is characterized by stasis. That simply means that, let's say cats show up, boom, suddenly, and then they stay cats. They are steady, stasis. They don't turn into anything. They're cats. Now they may go extinct, or they may still be alive today, but they show up suddenly and they stay what they are. And here is Niles Eldridge. He's an evolutionist from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. He says, there's a simple ineluctable truth that virtually all members of a biota remain basically stable with minor fluctuations throughout their duration. Minor fluctuations, microevolution, no macroevolution. And then number three, so abrupt appearance, stasis. And number three, the fossil record is characterized by distinct gaps. Here's Ernst Mayr. He's professor emeritus at the Museum of Comparative Zoology in Harvard. And he says, quote, given the fact of evolution, one would expect fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestors to descendants. But it's not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in about every phyletic series. So they say, well, we think that this evolved into that, but they don't have the fossils linking them together slowly. It's like you see this, and then poof, you see that. gaps. Now, you can make up stories. Let's say, for example, that there was a huge war and the whole world was destroyed in a nuclear inferno and only a few of us survive, and some years later we start to dig in the earth and we start to find these machines from a past age. And we start to dig up a machine called a tractor. We're like, whoa, this is really interesting. Look at this tractor machine. This is like a fossil machine from some previous age. And then we dig a little more and we find a locomotive. What's that? A locomotive. Look at that thing. And then I say, hey, I have a theory that this tractor over millions of years evolved into that locomotive. Now you're laughing at me and you say, well, no, I don't think that would happen. And then we find the missing link. There it is. The missing link has been found. You see how you can just take things and stick it in the middle of a series and say this evolved to this, evolved to this? You're just making up stories. Now, we know, in fact, that this probably came along well before that. But, hey, you know, this is kind of mid-sized between the two. You can make a story up about it. And that's what the evolutionists are doing, is they're just making up stories. Now, I have a question for you. When you find a rock, let's say it's limestone or something like that, how do the evolutionists know how old it is? I'm saying it's not in different layers where you could see how far down it is. You just find a rock maybe in a riverbank where maybe it's kind of gotten carried down by the river from somewhere up there, and so you have some limestone. Well, how do you know 100 million year old limestone, this is just limestone, from 600 million year old Cambrian limestone? How do you know how old these rocks are? How do they date the rocks? Who knows? Yes? That's true, they do put them in different categories. You have, for example, limestone, shale, sandstone. But how do we know how old they are? Because you can have old limestone way buried down here, and you can have newer limestone up here, and you can have some limestone right on the surface. It's limestone, yeah?
They just make up another theory?
Okay, they go on a little bit more than just plain making it up. We're not completely off the side, yeah. Okay, so we do want to talk about radiometric dating. We're going to talk about that tomorrow night. That's fairly new, but how were they dating them even in Lyell's day and in Darwin's day before we had radiometric dating?
I guess by telling by like the chipping away the rocks.
Okay, they're chipping away in the rocks, but what are they finding when they chip it away? Fossils! Bingo! That's the key. They will date the rocks by something called index fossils. What's an index fossil? I've got this cool little trilobite right here. This is a real trilobite. They find these things in Morocco. You can come hold it, but be careful because it did cost me a little bit of something. It's a real one. And a trilobite, according to the evolutionists, evolved in the Cambrian period and then went extinct. So when you find a rock with a trilobite in it, guess how old that rock is? It's Cambrian. It's 600 million years old. Well, how do you know that? Because these critters evolved in that time and then went extinct in that same time. Okay. So therefore, that must be a 600 million year old rock. But here is the problem, my friends. If you are going to date the rocks by the fossils, you're assuming evolution right from the beginning. You're assuming when things evolved or when they went extinct. For example, you see this little fishy here? This is a geological time scale, and that fish was supposedly extinct 80 million years ago, according to the evolutionary story. That's the assumption. So you find a coelacanth in a rock, you can say that rock has to be 80 million years old. Well, how do you know? Because that's when they went extinct. Oh, and then somebody that didn't know any better caught one, alive and kicking, off the coast of South Africa. Oops. So now what does it mean if you find a rock with a coelacanth? It could have been 10 years ago. It doesn't mean anything. You see how they're assuming evolution. They assume their stories are true to date the rocks. And then they want to use the rocks to prove evolution. It's a big circle. How do we know evolution is true? Because of the fossil record. Well, how do you know how old all these things are? Well, because of evolution. That's called a circular argument, circular reasoning. Here's an evolutionist, Niles Eldredge. If we date the rocks by the fossils, how can we then turn around and talk about the pattern of evolutionary change through the fossil record? Exactly. Exactly. All right, so we talked about biogeography, or recapitulation, the fossil record. Here's one of the things that Darwin liked to do. Darwin liked to make fun of God. Darwin would say, if there was a creator, he would never do it like that. That's a bad design. And make fun of things like this. And so it was called the panda principle. Why is it called the panda principle? Well, it's kind of like a panda. Let me use a book. Let me use a book here. A panda doesn't have an opposable thumb like we do. So if you're going to pick up a book, you're going to use your thumb, right? Because you got a good grip to oppose things with your thumb. You got a strong grasp. Now, I could maybe pick this thing up with my other fingers, but it is not easy. We don't have opposable other fingers like we have an opposable thumb. The panda doesn't have an opposable thumb. His thumb is just like this. And so the evolutionists will say, well, if a creator knows how to build a good thumb, why would he give the panda a bad thumb like that? They make arguments like this. And they make fun of God and say, well, God couldn't have done it like that, so therefore it must have evolved. Now, it works fine for the panda. He's stripping bamboo with it, and it's no big deal. He's eating it, so it's not a problem for him. But they will use arguments like that to say it's a bad design. It's poorly engineered. And then they'll say things like this. Why would a creator use different designs, like octopus eyes are different from human eyes or different from fly eyes? And if somebody knew how to make eyes, why not just make them all the same? See? And so they will use that. And then they'll talk about what are called vestigial organs. Who knows what a vestigial organ is? Okay, yeah, you better know what a vestigial organ is, Georgia. Tell us what a vestigial organ is. A leftover. We talked about this for dinner tonight. This was our dinner conversation with Dino Dave, was vestigial organs. Can someone give me, besides Georgia and Isaiah, can somebody give me an example of a vestigial organ? Yes, ma'am. Your appendix. Little secret, Dino Dave had his appendix out when I was in like third grade, and it almost ruptured. Another little secret, Pastor had his appendix out too. We're kind of like cousins here, you know? Appendix cousins. And so these are leftovers. Somebody give me another one. Appendix, and there's another famous one. Yeah? Tonsils, yeah. Oh, these are leftovers. You don't need them. You can take them out. It's no big deal. But they're leftover from our evolutionary past. We don't use these anymore. So how come a creator would make these leftovers? Now, here's Stephen Jay Gould, and he's arguing for evolution. He says, odd arrangements and funny solutions are the proof of evolution. Paths that a sensible God would never tread, but that a natural process constrained by history follows perforce. So he says when you have these little odd things like vestigial organs, that's proof that we evolved and not that there was a God. Now here's the interesting thing. William Paley, who I mentioned yesterday, in his book Natural Theology, actually answered the question hundreds of years ago. I read his book and I'm like, bingo! He has it right. On page 34, William Paley says, why resort to contrivance when power is omnipotent? In other words, why make a little odd design? When you get all kinds of power, you could make it however you wanted. Here's what he says. It's only by the display of contrivance, the existence of the agency and the wisdom of the deity could be testified to as rational creatures. Now, he's using kind of big words. Let me illustrate. Let's say that Pastor Josh and I go out for a little boat ride, and our boat capsizes, and we get stuck on an island. And all we have to eat is coconuts and bananas, and, you know, we're getting sick of eating all that. We're kind of getting sick of each other, you know. I mean, it's like day after day on this island, right? And then I look out there, and I see a bottle floating, and it looks like it's got a message. I said, hey, Pastor Josh, swim out there and get that bottle. He's like, well, you swim out and get it. I said, okay, I'll swim out. So I swim out, and I get it, and I bring it back. And he says, give me that. And he opens it up, and he pulls it out, and it's a piece of paper with just straight lines on it. That's no message at all, right? It's like, I don't know, maybe it's a barcode or something. That's not a message. Well, what if instead of that, Pastor Josh pulls it out, and it's got little odd squiggles and dots and kind of curves. We go, ooh, maybe that is a message. Maybe that's some funny language, or maybe hieroglyphics or something. But there's maybe a message there. And what William Paley is saying is these odd designs, all these different eyeballs and this weird panda's thumb and all these strange flower designs, God is showing us his capacity for ingenuity. He's communicating his creativity. My friends, God could have made 3 stars, and it would have been awesome. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3. God made billions of them just in our galaxy. God could have made 3 colored flowers, a yellow one, an orange one, and a pink one. That would have been beautiful. But God made all these shades and scores of different flower colors. He's showing us his creativity. He's saying that I have all this power and all this intelligence. You see how God's communicating to us by that? He's telling us something. No, this is not an evolutionary thing. Well, what about these vestigial organs? The tailbone. Don't you know, Dino Dave? You have a tailbone right back there in the back of your backbone, and you sit on it, but that's because your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was an ape. And that's why you have a tailbone. Can I tell you something? How could losing a tail be a benefit? You're losing a function. There's times I wish I had a tail. I could close the door behind me. Hey, I play piano. You could cover some low notes with your tail, then the boom, 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 you know? It'd be kind of cool. You're talking about losing something as being an evolution? No, that's de-evolution. So I have never understood the argument, but can I tell you something? The tailbone is necessary to hold everything together. Try having it taken out and see how it feels to sit down. It wouldn't be good. This is not a leftover. It's very, very useful. How about the appendix? Well, there's the appendix, this little finger at the end of the large intestine, right where it attaches to the small intestine. And that appendix has now been proven to have a wonderful use. The bacteria, the healthy bacteria that's in your stomach and in your intestines gets stored there. It's kind of dormant, it's kind of sleeping there. But if you get a nasty disease like dysentery, where it's nasty to talk about, but you just like have the runs all day long and everything just flows through you, all your good bacteria is going to get flushed right out and go down the toilet, and you're going to have a lot of problems digesting your food. Now, this appendix stores the bacteria, and that'll come back to life and repopulate your intestines. So if Pastor or I get dysentery, we're going to have to maybe have some special medical help. We would be in bad shape if it wasn't for modern medicine. So here's a quote from 2009. Recent research by evolutionists has shown the appendix has an important function as a safe house for helpful bacteria so they can repopulate the intestines after diseases like dysentery. It's not vestigial at all. It's got a purpose. And our God knew that we could use it on occasion. Okay, that's a good time to take a stretch. Everybody stand up. You guys, I know this is technical, and you guys have been really good. You've been listening, you're paying attention, but let's just stand up. It is Monday night. Let's just do a quick stretch. Get a little oxygen in your lungs. Okay, very good. All right, grab a seat again. Grab a seat again. We're better than halfway through this here. We got one more evidence for evolution, and then I got a couple more points, and we'll wrap it up. But I want to talk about nested hierarchy. That is actually looking at the animals themselves and seeing they fit into nice little groups of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and all these different groups. Not only that, but there's these similarities within each of these groups, so that under the hood, a bat, even though it's flying, is less like a bird than it is like us. A mole, even though it's digging and grubbing around, is built more like us than maybe an insect. A whale or a dolphin, his skeletal structure, he's a mammal, he's closer in skeletal structure and function to us, even though he's swimming, than he is to a fish. So I'm going to just give you one of an example that the evolutionists like to show in their books on evolution. They will show you a 5-fingered hand. It's called a pentadactyl limb. 5 fingers. We all have it, right? Well, guess what? Because they're a mammal, bats have it and they use it to fly with. The monkey uses it to manipulate like us. The mole uses it. He's a mammal. He uses it to dig. And the dolphin uses those 5 fingers to swim with, unlike a fish's flippers. And they say, well, why is that? Well, it's because our great-great ancestor, who was a mammal, had 5 fingers, and even though some have evolved to be in the ocean, some have evolved to fly like a bat, they're all mammals, and they're all stuck with these 5 fingers. And that is, in my opinion, one of their better arguments for evolution, is these similarities in these groups. Here's Charles Darwin in his book. He says, it's truly wonderful. All animals and plants throughout all time are related to each other. And he didn't have all the fossils to prove it at the time, but he says, if my theory is true, numberless intermediate varieties must surely have existed. And he thought, well, just keep digging, we'll find the fossils. Well, it's been hundreds of years and we still haven't found the fossils. Now, we could imagine some scenarios that would give some really good evidence for the evolutionary family tree. By the way, Darwin had only one illustration in his whole book, and it was this, a tree of life. And he thought that was a powerful way to illustrate how a common ancestor slowly over time evolved into maybe reptiles and mammals and birds and fish and all this diversity over time. Now, if we have a clear common ancestor that we all agreed, hey, that's clearly the common ancestor, and if we had really gradual evolution at least once in a while happening, where we had the missing links, and if we had a lot of these things right at the transition points, I would agree they've got pretty good evidence for evolution. That's not what they have. That is not what they have. No, this tree of life has pretty much fallen apart. Here is 1987, and it's Stephen Jay Gould. The extreme rarity of transitional fossils in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. What's Stephen Jay Gould saying? He's saying, well, we can draw a tree. We can put fish here and amphibians, frogs, and dinosaurs and stuff there. But what's that? Nobody knows. And where's the between a fish and a frog? Yeah, we don't illustrate that. So the real pattern of life is much more vague. Yes, you have reptiles up here, maybe the dinosaurs and the lizards and the turtles, and they're all closer to each other than they are to the mammals, the cats and the dogs and maybe the rats or whatever. So there's definitely groupings, but there's no clear line from one to the other. And the evolutionists will draw a tree around it and say, well, that's how it evolved. Now watch this. You can take that same evidence and you can say, no, the cats have always been cats, the dogs have always been dogs. It's just how you interpret it. So 1987, Stephen Jay Gould said there's really no evidence, we're just making up stories. Have things improved since then? Here is 2022. Matthew Wills, professor of evolutionary paleobiology, says, it turns out we've got lots of our evolutionary trees wrong. For over 100 years, we've been classifying organisms according to how they look, and we put together anatomically, but molecular data, that's the genetics, often tells a rather different story. And this is in an article entitled, Evolutionary Trees Could Be Wrong. Wow. They're giving up on the evolutionary tree of life. Well, why does our Creator organize things in groups so that it all fits like the reptiles and mammals? You find something in the fossil record, oh, it's a mammal, you put it over here. Oh, here, this one's a reptile, we put it there with the dinosaurs. And why do we have these groups of things? Well, a wonderful book by a creationist says there is a pattern to life because God is trying to send us a message that there was one designer. It's not like there's lots of different gods that kind of each made their own things. No, there's one God. And he put the thing together in a beautiful design. So he's communicating something to us. Okay, that's the big picture of the fossil record. Lots of problems for evolution. Now the evolutionists, let's kind of get down in the weeds a little bit. The evolutionists have a few things they like to point to over and over again and say, here it is. This is a half this and half that. And one of their favorites is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is a really weird bird. They found this back in the days of Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, and it's a bird that has an actual tail, not just tail feathers, but actual vertebrae going down, a caudal vertebrae. It actually has teeth in the beak, really weird, and claws on the wings. So it's a very odd bird. But it's still a bird. But they'll say, well, it's maybe kind of a half a dinosaur. It's a missing link. And so Archaeopteryx. Well, here is Alan Fiducia. He's a world authority on birds, and he says, paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur. It's not. It's a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleo babble is going to change that. This guy's an evolutionist. It's very bird-like. It has a few odd features, but it's a bird. Again, we just have the fossil of it here, but here's a quote from Peter Willenhofer. The modern structure of the feathers of Archaeopteryx and their organization into a wing as an airfoil are typically bird-like. Now, the evolutionists are so desperate to find something that's kind of a half dinosaur and a half bird that there was a fake fossil from China that smugglers brought out and sold to National Geographic, and National Geographic spent all this money for the thing, and it was a fake from China. Modern paleontology's greatest embarrassment. Oh, they put major headlines on the thing, breaking news, National Geographic, and it was a fake. Well, long before a dinosaur had have wings that would fly, it had half a wing, which would be useless. So no, I don't think dinosaurs ever evolved into birds. Well, what about Tiktaalik? Oh, Dino Dave, here's a fish, and it's starting to get legs, and it's starting to crawl up onto land. And so many evolutionists think this is the best example of a missing link, a swimming fish that's starting to become an amphibian. Well, it is a little bit of a weird fish. Okay, it's got a flat head, and it doesn't have normal fins. It has almost kind of like limbs. But we think, as creationists, that it was just because it was maybe living in a swampy area, and God made it that way so that it could, move its way through the brush and the weeds and stuff like this. And by the way, there are fish today that can climb up on the land and then go back down in the water. Here's the handfish. And there's another fish that's called the frogfish, and it'll come up on the land. And by the way, there's fossil footprints, trackways in Poland that are 10 million years earlier than Tiktaalik. So how is Tiktaalik the first fish that's starting to get ready to climb on land when there's already things walking around on land? No, that one doesn't work. Well, then you go to the textbook and they'll talk about horse evolution. They'll say, well, we can prove the horse evolved from a little deer-like fella into the big modern horse, and we have all these beautiful in-between steps, Dino Dave. We've got all the missing links. It's just perfect, and they'll show it this way in the textbook. But here's what they don't tell you. This lived the same time as this, and this was buried much deeper than that. So they kind of just arranged it the way they like it. And these fossils are at the American Museum of Natural History. Last year, I went to the American Museum of Natural History, and they changed the display. I about fell on the floor. I mean, for years, we've been telling the people this is a lie. The textbooks are giving you a lie. And now, I had to take a photo at the American Museum of Natural History. It says a textbook case revisited, and they have the fossils back there still, but they basically say, well, it's not quite how we've presented it all through the years. It really isn't good evidence for evolution at all. Thank you very much. Can you get it out of the textbooks, please? Here's another one. They talk about whales. The whale is a mammal. And the whale was once something like a cow. And the cow got a little too close to the ocean. He fell in, and he evolved into a whale. Now you may be chuckling, but why do they say that whales are like cows? Well, the stomach, they have the multi-chambered stomach like a cow, and they have these vestigial leg bones. You see that up there? Kind of a little hip bone up there, the remnants of a leg. And they say, well, that's because the cow's great ancestor was walking around before he became a whale. Vestigial leg bones. Well, we have a mixed audience, so I want to be delicate about this. But in recent years, here's 2014, new whale research has turned a long-accepted evolutionary assumption on its hips. Instead of being vestigial, whale pelvic bones play a key role in reproduction. Let's just put it this way, they support certain parts of the anatomy without which you wouldn't have baby whales. So here's Encyclopedia Britannica. The evolutionary origin of whales remains controversial amongst zoologists. My friends, you can make up stories all day long. But that's all they're doing is just making up stories. They don't have any clear missing links at all. They're all still missing. I can make up a story. See if you like my story. Here is a cloud. A cloud is 99% water, H2O. Here's a watermelon. The watermelon is 92% H2O. Therefore, the watermelon and the cloud share a common ancestor. Yes, of course. Okay. We've gone through the evolutionist arguments. Let's talk about biological complexity for just a minute. I was talking with somebody about this yesterday. Maybe you and I were talking about it. Bingo, we're going to talk about it right now. There is no such thing as a simple life form. A single-celled bacterium, one cell that you look at in a microscope, is crazy complicated. All these missing pieces, if you just took a couple of them out, it would die. You got to have all the pieces there. It's critical. And so how are you going to get all the mitochondria and the DNA and all this communication systems and transportation and energy production and waste disposal all coming together at the same time? It doesn't make sense. If the chromosomes from one person were stretched out, they would reach back and forth to the moon 100,000 times. That's how much information it takes to make a you. And you can put it all into a teaspoon. Crazy amounts of information. How are you going to get a DNA molecule and the control kits and the RNA and the ribosomal machinery and all the enzymes all to kind of happen to come together in a warm little pond somewhere? It's just not going to happen by chance. It's like believing a bunch of apes just typing on typewriters could type out the complete works of Shakespeare by accident. Come on, I don't have enough faith to believe something like this. And yet you read things in textbooks like this. The transformation into a primitive living cell capable of further evolution appears to require overcoming an information hurdle of super astronomical proportions, an event that could not have happened within the time frame of Earth except, we believe, as a miracle. Wow. Remember how it was okay to have a miracle for the Big Bang? Well, now it's okay to have a miracle to get life from non-life. It's okay to have miracles when you need them for evolution. Now, some people say, well, haven't we made life in the laboratory? No. Even with millions of dollars of equipment and some of the smartest minds in science, we cannot produce life in the lab. The best we can do is boil some water, add some methane, add a spark, cool it off, and down here we start to get some red goo. Now, that red goo is not alive. It's a complicated molecule called an amino acid. But that amino acid has to be made into a long chain and then folded up just right, and that will become a protein. One tiny little piece, maybe a hook joint or a ball bearing or a nut or a bolt, which then becomes part of the larger machine, which there's zillions of machines in a single cell. We're nowhere close to forming life. If all you needed to do was have all the ingredients, you could take a frog and put them in a blender. You have all the ingredients for a frog. Will they come together and make the frog again? How about if you give it 1,000,000 years? It's just going to get stinkier, my friends. But we read things in textbooks like this. This was Darwin's Warm Little Pond, the famous prebiotic soup. All these textbooks talk about soup. This is evolutionary analysis. Here's another one, zoology. The early organic molecules accumulate in the primitive oceans to form hot, dilute soup. Here's ecology textbook, 2020. Recently, it's been suggested hydrothermal vents are a potential site for the origin of life on Earth. Vent water may be the ultimate soup in the Sorcerer's Canticle. Soup, soup, soup. I'm waiting for Campbell's Soup to come out with primordial soup, and there will be your grandfather right there in the can. I don't have enough faith to believe this kind of stuff, my friends. In science, we have something called the law of biogenesis, proven by a guy by the name of Louis Pasteur. And Louis Pasteur was a French Christian, a creationist, and he showed that you're not going to get life from non-life. If you sterilize it and seal it, it's not going to get bacteria. It's not going to start to grow mold. And his process, we still do today, it's called pasteurization. And you drink pasteurized milk and you have pasteurized cheese. A Christian showed you can't get life from non-life. It's a scientific law. So the law of biogenesis basically kills off the whole Darwinian story of goo to you via the zoo. It's not going to happen. You need a creator. You need a designer. And that's just to get a little bacteria. How do you go from getting a bacteria to getting eyeballs and wings and feathers and sonar and bats? And I mean, even Darwin struggled with the eyeball. He wrote in his book, suppose the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. He tried to argue for it, but it was absurd to think that happened by chance. The retina of your eye, in less than 2 square inches, has 100 million light-sensitive cells. We talked about the complexity of one cell, 100 million of them. We can agree with the psalmist, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. A scientist by the name of Michael Behe wrote a book, and he said, life's complicated systems are kind of like a mousetrap. If you had a mousetrap that's got a base and a holding bar and a spring and a bait and a catch and a hammer, and you took away one of those pieces, how many mice would you catch? Zero. They all have to be there at the exact same time in the right place, or the whole thing doesn't work. So how are you going to start to assemble the first cell little bit by little bit over millions of years? It won't work unless it's all there. And a mousetrap is simple compared to even a single-celled bacterium. Let me tell you about a bacteria. A bacteria is a single-celled organism, just one little round ball, but on his back he has an outboard engine that spins like this, and it's called a flagellum. Why do I call it an outboard engine? Because we make outboard engines that have all these same parts: a rotor, a gear assembly, stators, bushings, universal joint. And this outboard engine runs at 100,000 RPM. Now, some of you guys that understand cars, what would happen if I were to take my Nissan out there and crank it up to 100,000 RPMs? It would blow up. Jet engines run at 100,000 RPMs. But we can't make engines this good. This thing can stop in a quarter of a turn and change directions. Try doing that with a jet engine. Not a good idea. Let me show you this thing. Look at this little thing. This amazing outboard engine that God made that drives this bacterium through water. And it's made of 40 different proteins, and if you took one of those proteins away, guess what? It's dead in the water. That's just the tail of the bacteria that allows it to move. And so this is a evolutionist in a journal in 2017 saying the bacterial flagellum exemplifies a system where even small deviations from the highly regulated flagellar assembly process can abolish motility and cause negative physiological outcomes. Huh? What's he saying? Can somebody put it in your own words? What's he just said right there? Yeah.
If you mess with it at all, it ain't gonna work.
Yeah, you mess with it all, it ain't gonna work. Why couldn't he just have said that? Make it too easy to understand. Here's 2022. Thus, survival of the fittest is illogical when proposed as adequate for selecting the origination of complex major new body types and metabolic functions, because the multiple changes in multiple genomes that are required have intermediate stages without an advantage. In other words, it all has to get slowly put there together. There's no advantage till it all comes together. Selection would not reasonably occur, and the disadvantage of death would logically prevail. My friends, this is 2022. They're finally admitting the truth. Biological complexity is a killer for evolution. And then there's mechanism challenges. Well, natural selection makes a nice story, but the reality is that mechanism doesn't get you from a frog to a prince. It just doesn't. Yes, some things survive a little better, but sometimes it's not even because they're more fit. It's survival of the luckiest. You're not going to tell me that this fish was more fit than that one because he had it on that side of the whale's mouth. No, it's just survival of the luckiest. In fact, the Bible even says the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor yet favor to the man of skill, but time and chance happens to them all. That's what's the real world. That's how it happens out there. Even if natural selection was up for the job as a mechanism for evolution, it would not add new information. It doesn't describe arrival of the fittest. It just simply selects from what's there. Do you understand that? Somehow you have to get something that is a new mechanism, a new, like an eyeball or a capability of flight or sonar and bats or something, and then natural selection might say, oh, let's have this one survive more than the others, and this would then spread through the population. But how do you get a beneficial mutation for a sonar? Mutations mess up the genome. It's copying errors. And you get things like two-headed turtles. You get things like congenital birth defects. You don't get whole new wonderful, biological systems. Here's Werner Gitt, and Werner Gitt is the head of the German Institute of Physics, and he says, information only arises through an intentional volitional act. There's no known natural law through which matter can give rise to information, neither is there any physical process or material phenomenon known that can do this. So the evolutionists are just going on faith. There's no evidence for it. There is not, my friends. I want to take you back to 2 Peter to close things out tonight. Because 2 Peter, the old crusty fisherman, says, here's what's going to happen in the end times. It's going to come scoffers. And they're here, my friends. And he says what they're going to say, and it's exactly what they're saying. And he says how to answer them, and we're going to talk about it in the next 2 nights. I hope you come out. But then he says what their motivation is. Why do they hang on to their scoffing when it's so obvious that it's not logical? 2 Peter 3:10 says this, "The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with a fervent heat, and the earth shall be burned up." My friends, if there is a creator, and the Bible's right, and it is, then every one of us is going to stand before God. And all the things around us that people are so worked up about and so concerned about are going to be gone. That's why they don't want to think in terms of a creator. The consequences, the accountability is something they don't want to have in their brain to think about. They want to be God. How about you tonight? Have you made your peace with God? Are you ready for that day when God comes back to judge this earth? You see, the Bible says there's only two places we're going to go. Either we've made our peace with God and we're going to go to a place that God calls heaven, where we're going to live with him in joy and happiness. There'll be no more sorrow, no more pain, no more aches, no more degenerations, no more mutations, no more struggles. A beautiful place that he calls paradise, the New Jerusalem, or a place of punishment that the Bible calls hell. A place for those who haven't made their peace with God, who haven't had their sins forgiven, who are still at enmity with God. Oh, my friends, can I say to you this? We don't know. We don't know how much longer we've got. I dare say the signs are pointing that we're in the end times. The best thing you could do tonight would be to make your peace with God if you haven't yet. Let's pray. Every head bowed, every eye closed, no one's looking around. Just before I invite Pastor to come up, is there anybody with an upraised hand to say, Dino Dave, right there at the end, you kind of hit home with me, and I don't know for sure if I died today where I'd go, if I'd go to heaven or hell, but I sure would like to know. I'm going to lift up my hand. Please pray for me. Anybody like that at all in the whole room? Just lift your hand up briefly and put it back down. I see that young man, you can put it back down, and I see that young man, you can put it down. Anybody else? Got a couple of boys that lifted up their hands. Anybody at all? Lift up your hand if you want me to remember you in prayer. Father in heaven, I remember these two young men. Lord, don't know if they've made their peace with you, but there's some doubts in their mind right now. Father, I pray they would come to assurance of faith in Christ. They might talk perhaps to pastor or me or maybe even their parents. And Lord, I pray that they would come to full assurance of their faith in Jesus Christ. Lord, we thank you that not only have you created this world, given us lots of evidence for design, but someday you're coming back to set it all straight. And we say, even so, come quickly, Lord Jesus. For it's in his name we pray. Amen.